I want to talk about this myth that comes up from time to time about big greedy corporations moving their jobs overseas to exploit workers in the third world and laugh as unemployment rises in the US. Spoiler alert, that's not really how it happens. Here's how the argument runs. You have a factory here in the US. You have to pay the workers a certain amount of money, but overseas, you only have to pay the workers a tenth as much, so you close down the factory here and open it over there. That's called exporting jobs. American companies send their work overseas to make the products that they sell back to the same Americans whose jobs they took away. Politicians of both parties keep pledging to put a stop to this. They don't say how they plan to do so, but that doesn't seem to matter to voters in the mainstream media. People are all too happy to parrot the party line. But this argument fails on several fronts. First, wages have always been lower in those countries. So why weren't those jobs moving overseas in the 60s and 70s? It wasn't really any more difficult then to set up shop elsewhere and import to the US. In fact, Japanese car makers did a very good job of that during that time period. Second, it's interesting where the jobs aren't going. By and large, they aren't going to impoverished areas of sub-Saharan Africa, despite the fact that wages are even lower there. Third, wages in America are lower than wages in countries like Germany and Japan, so why aren't we getting their jobs? Obviously, there's something else going on here. Let's examine just what it is that businesses in the US have to go through in order to function. There are lots of taxes and other regulations that are based on the person you hire. So when you hire someone, instead of just paying his wages, you have to pay these payroll taxes too, as well as comply with all sorts of government regulations about whom you can hire and so forth. If you're not in a right-to-work state, you might have all sorts of arbitrary union rules you have to follow just to be legally allowed to operate. If you hire an individual to work for $10 an hour, he'll most likely end up costing you $20 or $30. Companies might have to make major changes whenever Congress or federal regulators change the rules, and they change all the time. Every regulation, every new policy, every new government program designed to help consumers or workers or whomever increases the cost of doing business. In fact, businesses in the United States spend more money every year complying with federal, state, and local regulations than they make in profit, and it's been that way for decades. Witness the fact that most big corporations lobby for these new rules and regulations, because they know that they can absorb the additional costs better than their smaller competition. And it's also easier for them to move overseas, whereas the smaller competition might have to go out of business entirely. This is the truth of it. If a factory isn't profitable, it's going to close down. Whether or not a new one opens overseas is a completely separate undertaking. Think about it. You've got a factory here in the US that makes $1 million a year in profits. You can open an identical factory overseas and get $10 million a year profit. So naturally, according to the myth, you're going to close down operations in the US and open in that foreign country. But does this make sense? Why would you forego that extra $1 million in profit? Why not keep both factories open and make $11 million? The only reason to close down a factory that makes any sense whatsoever is because that factory isn't making money at all. But if that's the case, you'd close down the factory anyway, regardless of whether or not you could move overseas. The choice isn't staying here or going overseas, it's go overseas or go out of business entirely. This situation is absolutely the result of government interference. So to call for even more government interference is nothing short of insanity. In fact, the only solution to this problem is simply to repeal all of the regulations that's put American companies in this situation to begin with. And before you begin with all the typical talking points of big government apologists about how deregulation was responsible for the housing crisis, unemployment, big corporate mergers, income inequality, plagues of locusts, global warming, and the great train robbery, you need to be able to answer this simple challenge that I have been asking for years and that no one has been able to meet. Can you cite one section of the Code of Federal Regulations that was removed without being replaced? If you can't even do that much, you have no basis for saying there was deregulation at all, let alone that it was responsible for all of these problems. You may not like deregulation. You may think there are perfectly good reasons for these rules and regulations. But ask yourselves this: how many people is it worth sending to the unemployment line for your idea of an ideal society? And how many jobs is too many to lose?